Welcome to Writers Read. This has been such a rich event week after week after week. I've enjoyed it. Today we're going to start, of course, with Paul's poem. And I say a line and you say a line. Here we go. Write, write, write.
Write, write, write.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Then read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring us great delight.
Bring us great delight.
I'm going to use my notes today to say thank you to some people. Thank you first of all to Paul and Linda Niebank, who so believe in sharing the written word of our community and has made this all happen. It's been a good experience for everyone. Thank you, Linda and Paul. And now let's thank Carrie Krensky, who seems to have the magic touch with this camera and with the microphones. Let's cheer for Carrie. And let's cheer for Risa, who is steady as she goes. We can count on Lisa to stop by, check in, make some arrangements, make some changes, and then things are settled. Thank you so much, Risa. And then let's thank Patrick. Patrick comes in, and every week has been a little different than the week before. So Patrick comes in, checks with Linda, and he's been steady as he goes too. So thanks to Patrick. And Ina Bray, 4 years ago, got all of this started. So dear Ina, thank you one more time. And thank you to these readers that we heard this spring. Number 1, Paul Niebank. Number 2, John Wilson. Number 3, Peggy Johnson. Number 4, George Counts. Number 5, Audrey Whitecamp. Number 6, Bob Corwin. Number 7, Marcia Iverson. Number 8, Mary Piet. Number 9, Erwin Saracen. Number 10, Ann Pound. Number 11, Ann Brandt. Number 12, Lou Templeton. Number 13, Ina Bray. Number 14, Grace Popoff. Number 15, Barbara Ray. And number 16, Nancy Wiesner. Thank you, writers, for sharing with us. And today we hear Peggy and Lou. And Peggy, thank you for being here today. Thank you for reading for us. And I wrote you earlier in the week that you might have a little tip for all of us writers.
Well, mostly you ask if we used a device, and I always have. In the beginning it was a typewriter. I somehow started creating at the typewriter a long time ago, and that saw me through college and a couple of master's degrees 20 years apart. And but there was no personal computer yet until finally there was. And it's the most remarkable instrument. It has to be the writer's best friend. It is mine for certain. I could not have written this book without it. So.
Oh, that's a wonderful, wonderful sharing of a tip. And I bet you've heard the typewriter sound.
Yes.
That Carrie has put onto the 370
yes.
YouTube
yes.
playing of the video.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing you read.
I'm looking forward to reading.
Good. Okay.
And I'm reading today from this book I've written. It's called Mormor and Me, a memoir of my Swedish mother. And there are a couple of Swedish words in here that I can't pronounce. There's something about the American tongue that doesn't deal well, especially with S and J together. But this book is dedicated to my 7 grandchildren. so that they know something of their roots. And it has 10 chapters, and obviously I can't read very much of it today. I'll read from 3 chapters, only parts, or let's say pieces. That's Paul's word. I'll be reading pieces, and I'll start with the preface. 6 Scandinavians were marooned on an island. When they were discovered, the 2 Norwegians were fighting. The 2 Danes had formed a cooperative, and the 2 Swedes were waiting to be introduced. I saw this joke for the first time in Time magazine when they ran a cover story on Scandinavia many years ago. That's no joke, I thought. That's my Swedish family. Most of the people nearest and dearest to me were very reserved, yet quite warm and wonderful when you got to know them. To be too forward was number 1 on the list of social errors to be avoided, according to my mother and her sister, my Aunt May. Mother was more cautious than May, though, and this quality of standing back popped up in family members of other generations. Some of us have worked hard to overcome it. Mormor is in the title of this memoir because that is what my children called my mother, the Swedish word for grandmother or mother's mother. Her husband, my stepfather, also Swedish, was called morfar or mother's father. Before I begin to read, I must tell you that Mormor was a very private person, rarely sharing secrets with friends or family, although she did tell me certain things she thought would help me grow to be a happy adult. She also knew how to keep secrets. She had 3 big secrets, one until she died. This is my version of her story. Chapter 1 is called Orsunda, and the years are 1907 to 1920. About 2 hours north of today's Stockholm, Sweden, in the county of Gävleborg, in the traditional province of Gästrikland, Sandviken municipality, parish of Orsunda, in the small village of Lund near the Lake Storsund, lies a small rural cottage which housed the family Olson. There, Karin Victoria Olson was born on April 1st, 1907, in this home with no electricity and no running water. The farm was small too, with a cow, some chickens, and land to grow vegetables and berries. Little Karin Victoria, or Kaisa, was the 5th child and 2nd daughter of Carl Johan Olson and his wife Anna Larsdotter. Anna, my grandmother, had inherited the house and land because she was the eldest daughter of her parents, Lars Olson and Anna Jansdotter. Their sons, who would have been the usual heirs, had died as infants or children. My grandfather Carl had no land to inherit and thus came to live on his wife's farm. According to Swedish tradition, my ancestors' surnames each skipped a generation. And this is going back on the male side of my grandmother's family. Anders Persson was born in the 1600s, Per Andersson, 1673, Anders Persson, 1701, Per Andersson, 1728, and Anders Persson, 1761. Each eldest son was given the first name of his grandfather, and a new last name was formed with the first name of his father. Because of this custom, many enlisted men in Sweden had identical names, so their commanding officer would sign them new, unique names, which is probably how my great-grandfather Olaf received his hyphenated surname, Andersson Rund. Sweden has perhaps the finest collection of genealogy information in the world for 2 reasons. The church is where the information was collected and kept, and 2, the churches were never bombed in this pacifist nation. In 1942, the parish of Orsunda published a large and beautifully bound book of all the family information in the parish going back to the 1600s. Thanks to my marvelous Aunt May, who saved a copy until she died, that copy now belongs to me. I can trace my grandmother's people back, as you can see. Unfortunately, I cannot do the same for my grandfather. On that first visit to Sweden and Orsunda in 1978, my husband Rick, our eldest child David, and I were soon told of my grandfather's history by my two Swedish uncles and cousins. It seems that Carl Johan Olson was the child of a young Sami woman who had come down from Lapland, now called Sapmi, in northern Sweden with her father to sell crafts and trinkets such as useful and creative things carved from reindeer horn that you will still find today. She died giving birth to my grandfather. The father, a local man, was unknown. In an early example of Swedish social welfare in action, the baby was supported by the village and raised by the family who would do this for the least amount of money. Apparently his Sami grandfather had tried to care for the baby, but could not manage the task as he moved about. Later I learned from my mother that her father had a very good upbringing, better than my mother's, she said. I knew from family stories over the years that he grew to be a wonderful man. My uncles and cousins in Sweden thought that this was a great family story too, and we did. We did too. I have lap legs, said my cousin Ava. Upon reflection, I decided that I have lap legs too. When we arrived home, I asked my mother, "Why have you never told me that your father was the child of a young woman from Lapland?" She replied with the barest flicker of a grin, "You never asked." I overheard Aunt May say to her, "Can you imagine that Helmer told Peggy that?" I appreciate facts more than secrets, and I am deeply touched by the true story of this young woman, my great-grandmother, losing her life so far from home. There is a reason that I rejoice for myself and all the descendants of my Swedish grandparents. Because of intermarriage for generations in the small parish of Orsunda, there are congenital conditions studied by scientists at Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. By marrying my grandfather, my grandmother diversified the gene pool. The house at Orsunda. On that first visit, we were enchanted by the beauty of the driveway lined in trees and by the little house and its setting, the typical cottage for that area, stained dark red with white trim. The stain for the cottages was a byproduct of the great copper mine at Falun. The story is that a wooden pole stuck in a pile of this red dirt at the mine showed no signs of rot. It was simply stained dark red and stood up to the weather. People began to use the stain on their houses, finding that it preserved the wood. The color became typical of Swedish cottages. An old log cabin was usually under the board and batten exterior of such houses, and the Swedes brought this architecture to America. The house in Orsunda had 3 rooms on the first floor, including the kitchen, and 2 rooms on the second. There were never many of the 7 siblings living at home at the same time. Young people ended their schooling at age 13, having by then the equivalent of an American high school education. They were expected to leave home and begin to help support the family. My grandfather Carl Olson worked at the large steel mill in Sandvik Steel, across the large lake from Orsunda. He was able to be home from Saturday evening to late afternoon of Sunday, using the steamboat to go over and back. My grandmother Anna had primary responsibility for raising the children and running the farm. She sewed their clothes, made their shoes when they were young, tended the cow and the garden, all the chores of country women at that time. My mother spoke of falling asleep to the sound of her mother at the spinning wheel. My grandparents chose to call their 5th baby Karen, but her sister decided her middle name. My Aunt May, 10 years old when Karen was born, saw the local priest before my grandparents did. Enamored of England's Queen Victoria, she thought it an elegant middle name, told the priest about little Karen Victoria, and the name became official at the christening. Kaisa is the diminutive of Karen, and hence she was Kaisa in her youth. My mother told me about skiing on homemade wooden skis in the winter, how my grandmother washed their clothing in the lake in the summer, how she as a young girl once ate all the remaining raisins from the bottom of the glug cups at Christmas time when the guests went home, only to fall asleep until the next morning. Water came from an outdoor pump, then was heated in the black iron kitchen stove. When we first visited in 1978, there was still no toilet in the house. We needed to walk to the outdoor toilet in the barn, in a room with a sink, curtains in the window, and pretty rag rugs on the painted floor. My Uncle Helmer had converted the chicken coop to a charming summer cottage, while Uncle Ossian's family used the main house as their vacation home. What a thrill it was for me to sleep in the home of my grandparents and great-grandparents. Because of the Great Depression and World War II, I never met my Morfar and Mormor. Our elderly Mormor knitted sweaters for my baby sister and me shortly before she died, just after World War II. The sweaters were beautiful and special to us, but we, American children, outgrew them very quickly, and that made me very sad. An essay written by my Aunt May describes the childhood the children shared. My cousin Eva in Sweden found this essay, and it was translated from the Swedish by her late husband, Carl Kaldenius. Here Aunt May tells you some of what it was like to be a child in Orsunda so long ago. From our home in Lund, a part of Orsunda, we had a beautiful view of the lake. A small island with the name of Philholmen was situated only a short distance from the house. It was easy to wade out onto this little island, so it was one of the centers of our little world, a place to go and be undisturbed, a place to dream our dreams. There we could imagine together with the great Swedish writer Tegner how the ancient King Ring traveled to the feast of Vikings, how the ships of the Vikings left the shores of the church and sailed out on this great lake of ours. My brother Carl, 2 years older than I, could tell me that the Vikings used the Philholmen as a sort of harbor or base. Of course, I believed everything he told me. In my eyes, he was old and extremely wise. Our world was so small. She writes of skating on the lake in the winter, swimming in it in the summertime. And then she goes on, the sky ended behind the trees on the other side of the lake. The world could not be bigger than the lake. It was so huge, so deep, so without limits. After some years, when the seriousness of life started to diminish our dreams, the lake was still there, still fascinating, still soothing as in early childhood. The Great Lake was also a lake between Sandviken and Orsunda. The steamboat Emma kept the traffic going back and forth. My father was not the only one who earned his living by working on the other side of the lake. The ship had many full loads on Saturday evenings when the work week ended and all of those working people had to be back in Sandviken by Sunday night. Also, farmers sold their products in the market in Sandviken every Thursday, and it was quite an event for us to take the boat there. To go to meet the boat was a thrill. It was a meeting place for the old and the young. The steamboat also brought people to the nearest railway station, which was in Sandviken. Now Emma is only a memory. A causeway has been built, but the road moves over the Lake Storsjön, the Pearl of Gästrikland, my most beautiful memory of childhood. We come now to chapter 2, which is called Leaving Home, the years 1920 to 1927. 2 words start this chapter. Emigrate with an E, to leave one country to settle in another. Immigrate with an I, to come into a new country or region to settle there. There are things like that through the book for my grandchildren. Young Karen Victoria Olson left her home village to work at 13 in 1920. She toiled on a farm for a while. Then at 15, with the help of her older sister May, she secured a position as receptionist in a mental hospital in Stockholm. Because May was in training to become a nurse, she was able to watch over her sister to some degree. Karen was quite mature in looks and manner and had friends. She thought about becoming a nurse as well. In Sweden at the time, jobs were few, higher education was difficult to attain, decent housing was scarce, and a small farm could not support 7 children and their parents. America beckoned to Swedes for the same reason motivating most immigrants today, in search of a better life, or the immigrant's creed. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, about 1.3 million Swedes left Sweden for the United States. There was quality farmland available in the upper Midwest and high-paying jobs in industries and factories in the cities, primarily Chicago, which with 100,000 Swedes became known as the Swedish-American capital. Only Stockholm had more Swedish inhabitants. After a slowing in the 1890s, emigration from Sweden rose again, causing great concern in Sweden. A Parliamentary Immigration Commission was formed in 1907, the year of my mother's birth. It recommended social and economic reform, and the Commission's major proposals were implemented. It happened though that World War II broke out in 1914. Reducing immigration to a mere trickle. From the mid-20s, really, there was no longer a Swedish mass immigration. Karen's older siblings, 1 sister and 3 brothers, had all immigrated by then. My mother followed them in 1927. The 4 who preceded her siblings who came to America first, I have passages about all 4 of them, and I'll just touch on pieces for each. Carl Laurentius Olson, born in 1895, the eldest, he was called Lasse by his sisters. He was a favorite of women in Chicago when he first came to America, but he soon found his preferred place in a tiny spot called Daniel, Wyoming, south of Yellowstone, with the Grand Tetons soaring nearby. He ended up becoming a trapper, building a log cabin there, and staying there for the rest of his life. I was able to visit him several times, and he actually died in my mother's home in Washington State. Hulda Maria Olson became May in America. She sailed in 1925. She was an amazing support to my mother and to me, and she and her husband came to Washington State during the Second World War, because that was where my mother and I were. Johann Richard Olson, called John, he and his wife headed first for Lake Forest, Illinois, because there was a relative there. He had a wonderful job as chauffeur and gardener, living above the garage, but he did have epilepsy, and he wanted very much to return to Sweden and see this wonderful neurosurgeon there, thinking he could have a cure. They returned to Sweden. Elsa learned that the surgery could very likely take John's life. He didn't have it, and they spent the rest of their years at the family cottage in Orsunda. And then finally, Axel Gunnar Olson, my darling Uncle Axel, he arrived in Lake Forest at one point, but really headed for Washington State because he was traveling with a childhood friend, and that friend had relatives in Washington State. So Axel fell in love with an American girl, built her a lovely house, and it was to that house that my mother and I moved in 1942. Then there were the two youngest brothers who stayed home, did not emigrate, Helmer and Olson. And yes, they had a good life in Sweden. My mother's leaving then, Karin's departure. Karin sailed with her friend, also named Karin, from Gothenburg, Sweden on January 22nd, 1927, aboard the SS Drottningholm of the Svenska American Line, arriving in New York, then taking a train to Chicago. The two Karins had chosen the same destination in the U.S. that John and May had chosen, Lake Forest, Illinois. There lived Carrie Strum, a relative of my grandmother. Carrie had a laundry in a remodeled carriage house, and she was in an excellent position to know where domestic help was needed in the mansions of the town, and to provide temporary housing for Swedish relatives seeking employment. It was a very charming town for young immigrants, and no one could have predicted the grief waiting for my mother and me. We come to chapter 3 then, which is Lake Forest, and a quotation from F. Scott Fitzgerald. He wrote this in a letter to his daughter in July of 1940. Once I thought that Lake Forest was the most glamorous place in the world. Maybe it was. So you think of the creator of The Great Gatsby. I suspect he learned a lot during his times in Lake Forest. It was a beautiful suburb for the very wealthy, just north of Chicago in Lake Michigan. My mother in those years experienced the last years of the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and the beginning of World War II. Here she worked in the homes of the wealthy. Her first position was as an upstairs maid. She met and married my Scottish father, who played the guitar and sang like Frank Sinatra. She gave birth to me, and she had to make a major decision for our two lives. And if you like a tour of Lake Forest, it can be found in that movie of 1980, Ordinary People. It was filmed there.
Oh, Peggy, thank you so much. You really made the word immigrant and immigrant real.
Good.
Yes, I was thinking as you read how that must be to think of oneself as an immigrant, and then in a few weeks, months, years,
Right.
an immigrant.
Right.
Thank you so much. It was just a gift. Thank you so much, Peggy, really. Okay. So good to hear Peggy read that story, really. And I'm going to mention this again at the end of the hour, and I was supposed to mention it at the beginning of the hour, that this is the last of the spring Writers Read events, and we will resume again in the fall. And so start writing. That's what I can say, is get your writing going and get that. I love listening to the typewriter that Carrie has on channel 370. Lou, so good to see you. Welcome, welcome.
I am so happy to be here.
Oh, good, good, good. Now, do you have a writer's tip for us?
Oh, absolutely. I have a whole bunch. But number one is observe. Everybody has a story. I go to church and I see the little boy that comes in late. I make up a story about him. Why was he late? I used to ride the Greyhound bus. Everybody I saw on that bus, I made a story about. So observe. It's a wonderful way to keep your stories going.
Is the most important thing, I think, about a writer or a poet, to observe and remember those wonderful details. What a good tip. Thank you, Lou.
Oh, you're welcome.
Looking forward to hearing you read.
Okay. This is so different from what she has just read because this is fiction. It's made up.
Okay.
And it's very short. It is a short story. When I lived in Hong Kong, Radio Hong Kong had a short story contest. I wrote this story and it won first place. And they were to read it on Radio Hong Kong, but it happened that I was in China reading or taking stories about old pastors. So someone else read it. So this is the first time I've been able to read it. So we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Okay. The Faithful Husband. Cho glanced at his image in the mirror. Like most who entered the restaurants, he couldn't suppress the urge to sneak a quick glance at himself. A huge mirror, and he stood there for a few moments, just looking at himself. Then he clipped his name pin on his lapel of the black tuxedo, and he stole another look. Mature but still youthful and trim, he liked what he saw. The barber was right, the tint did make a difference. He wondered if Alain, the smart mouth busboy, would notice. Cho enjoyed his job as a maitre d'. Every night, he recognized a few regular customers. They responded to him. His face, pleasantly lined, seemed to smile even when he wasn't. In his 25 years at the Golden Phoenix, he had worked hard. The job provided well enough, too. Granted, when May was living, the paycheck went much further. What she accomplished with his salary was sheer magic. She never got behind on the rent, and by combing the market early every morning, she bought the freshest, cheapest items of the day. Her simple home cooking made the Golden Phoenix taste like leftovers. Yes, she was careful. Before $1 was spent, she took out money to send to Mama in China, and another for Jimmy's school fees. May would have loved the graduation last month. After all the scrimping and saving, it seemed unfair to be denied the rewards. This month, Jimmy would send part of his earnings back home, just as offspring had done generations before him. Business was brisk during the early evening. Families and groups celebrating special occasions filled up all the tables. Later, clusters of men filed in after business meetings, and groups of young people dropped in for a late-night snack before going home. After midnight, the business slackened. People came in pairs or individually, dawdling over their food as if postponing some unpleasant task. Cho recognized the feeling. He missed May. The night shift helped, but not very much. About 2, Cho showed a couple to a small table in the corner. From their appearance, he guessed that the girl was a Blue Moon escort, and the flabby, middle-aged, well-dressed fellow with her was probably the husband of some bored tai-tai who was out for an all-night mahjong party. When he returned to his station, Cho looked at the girl again. He figured she was from China. Strange, after such a long time, he could still tell the difference between the mainland Chinese and the Hong Kong locals. Although she wore heavy makeup, she didn't have that streetwise look of most escort girls. She was very pretty. Fascinated, Cho's eyes were drawn back to the corner again and again. If she scrubbed her face and unpinned her hair, she would be beautiful. He imagined her slim, well-proportioned body in a simple cotton samfu. She reminded him a little of the way May looked when he first met her. The couple argued, but that wasn't unusual. The girls often had trouble with tipsy clients. but this chap didn't seem drunk. The couple argued, but that wasn't unusual. The girls often had trouble. Oh, I read the same thing. This chap didn't seem drunk. Joe didn't see the couple leave, but later when he returned to his station, the corner was empty. The crabby cashier rose with raised eyebrows and narrowed eyes, handed him an envelope. She watched, shaking her head knowingly as he opened and read the message. The note consisted of an address, a time, and a name, Lisa. Joe looked at the clock. It was almost closing time. He could leave now, walk the few blocks to the address, and arrive at the appointed time, usually before catching the bus home. Joe changed from his tux into a t-shirt and black twill trousers. Tonight he wouldn't bother. Alarm started to say something, but stopped. Joe imagined stifled grins from the waiters and from Alarm as he escaped into the night. The coolness of the restaurant's overhead fans quickly forgotten as he cut his way through the heavy, stifling Hong Kong humidity. No doubt a typhoon was building up. As usual at this hour, people walked aimlessly along the streets lined with windowless facades, concealing seedy bars and night spots. The colorful, gaudy signs blinked hard to hide their secrets. But come dawn, and they would simply fade into the background as life returned to rows of identical shops, another day to tout. Cameras, electronics, jewelry, and tailor-made suits. Joe walked away from Wan Chai district and its bright lights into a dark alley that obscured everything but his imagination. His eyes gradually focused on the right number. The old pre-war building was probably crammed with people who couldn't get into government housing. Carefully, he climbed the dimly lit stairway to third floor. His eyes skimmed the dirty corridor and rested on a faint light escaping from a cracked door. A chain held the door loosely in place, but as he took another step, he heard the chain drop. The light widened. Joe hesitated and stepped inside. A small figure moved to him, arms open. His mind froze as the woman wrapped her arms around him. Spontaneously, he enveloped her body, feeling May's small breasts pressed against his chest. She whispered something unintelligible. What was she saying? "May I call you Baba?" she said quietly. She drew back and took his hand. "Please talk to me." "I don't understand," Joe heard himself saying as he led him to her bed, the bottom of 3 bunks stacked like shelves against the wall. He sensed the presence of motionless forms above him. "You are just as I remember my father. When I saw you looking at me, I wondered if you recognized me." She paused. Was she crying? "I wanted you to be my father, but I know that's impossible." She took his hands in hers. "Tonight's when I saw you watching me, I saw something in your face. Not like the others that looked at me, but like the way a father looks at a daughter he loves. Am I right?" She didn't wait for an answer, but continued in short, breathless statements, telling about her childhood and memories of her father. In the dim light, he could see her smooth, clean face and her long hair falling carelessly down her back. She was dressed in the same kind of sombrefou they always wore. She let her head drop on his black jacketed chest. He tried to make sense of what she was saying, but his thoughts kept wandering. He was still young. He needed a woman. There was no reason why he shouldn't marry again. My father didn't return after he was sent to the farms. Mama hoped I would do well in school, but I let her down. Lisa Cho hesitated. Maybe I could help you. I'm not wealthy, but, oh, no, she protested. I didn't invite you here to ask for help. I just wanted to talk to you, like I would to my father. But I wouldn't mind that since you're all along, maybe you and I could. Cho tried again. It's all right, really. I'm moving tomorrow. That's why I wanted you to come tonight. The man with me at the restaurant has rented a flat for me on the Peak. I'm leaving my job at the Blue Moon. He says I make him feel happy. Silly, isn't it? For that, he'll provide for me and see that my mother in China receives the little money each month. But Lisa, Cho tried again. There must be another way. A bunk above shook and creaked for an instant and grew still. The girl stood and moved quickly to the door. You must go. She'll be getting up any time now. Thank you for coming. She stepped to the door. I was right. You are very much like my father. She kissed his cheek, took a step back and closed the door. The chain dropped into place. Cho stopped at the foot of the stairs. Should he go back and ask for her address on the Peak? Shades of gray mist hinted the arrival of a new day. He studied the sky across the harbor. A storm was coming. He pulled off his tux jacket and walked to the bus stop. May, he whispered under his breath.
Oh my goodness, Lou. Oh, wow, I have met some new people. You have created some people I believe in and want to know more. Are you going to write some more?
I write every day.
Do you write every day, Lou?
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
That is my pastime.
Oh, Lou, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I was with you 150%. Oh,
Do
my.
I need to turn this off now?
And I'm just going to mention again that this is our last program for a few months, and do start writing. Get that pen out or get that computer out and start writing. We've had some inspirations tonight, haven't we? Thank you, Lou, and thank you, Peggy.